You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we're talking about John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness.
Do you read Sutter Kane?
What? Here we go.
This director of photography was who took over as Carpenter's DP.
Okay, then we're getting started, Josh.
We're good. Sorry.
Do it live. We're doing it live.
Oh my God.
Forget all the fancy intros. You're listening
live
to the
right
Fan2Fan Podcast. Welcome. What do? We talk about things that we are fans about. My name's Bernie. I'm one of the hosts. With me today, two returning guests, two amazing fans of the director that we're going to be talking about today, John Carpenter. But first, let me introduce Nick Diak. You can find Nick on his website, nickdiak, diak.com. You'll find his essays, his blog, links to his social media. He is a writer, a pop culture scholar, convention speaker, podcaster, various areas of interest that include neo-peplum, Italian Euro-spy cinema, exploitation cinema, H.P. Lovecraft, which is kind of germane to the topic, the movie we're going to be talking about today, Tikis and Cocktails, which I think is always germane to any topic, and along with his partner, Michelle Brittany, who also has been a previous Fan2Fan podcast guest. Thank you, Michelle. They co-host the H.P. Lovecraftian Podcast, which is dedicated to works inspired by Lovecraft. So, Nick, welcome to Fan2Fan.
Oh, it's always wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me, sir.
Thank you, Nick. And Nick and I are not alone. We are also joined by Josh Pruett at Zombie TARDIS on Instagram and Twitter. He is a Primetime Emmy and Annie Award nominated TV writer, author, storyboard artist, worked with Crunchyroll, Lego, Disney, DreamWorks, Netflix, Paramount. He's worked on Mystery Science Theater 3000, Last Kids on Earth, Doctor Who, Hamster and Gretel, and he wrote the middle-aged novel Shipwreckers, The Curse of the Cursed Temple of Curses, or We Nearly Died a Lot, which you know I love, with co-writer Scott Peterson. Josh, thanks for coming back.
My pleasure. No peplum yet from me, but hopefully, Nick, one day I'll get around to it.
Someday, but you know what? You've worked on so many projects that you're just fresh off of a Lovecraftian movie, if I'm not mistaken, which definitely ties into tonight's Lovecraft movie as well.
Absolutely, yeah. For those of you who haven't checked out Glorious from Rebecca McKendry on Shudder, I would get on it. It's an amazing movie. Story and screenplay by Todd Rigney and Josh Hall and David Ian McKendry, and it's a killer story. But yeah, definitely check it out. I got to do a little bit of storyboarding on that very, very early on, which was super fun and great to work with David and Rebecca on that.
Super congrats.
Hey, thanks. Yeah. And the response has been kind of amazing. I'm so thrilled for Rebecca and the team. It's awesome. I mean, I fell in love with the script as soon as I read it, but the movie is really special, super, super special, and people seem to dig it. So yeah, definitely. Speaking of Lovecraft.
There we go. Anytime we ever talk, I think we realize that we have a lot of connective tissue in movies, film, books that we've all digested, discovered along the way, you know, in our corners of the universe. And one thing that always seems to reoccur is John Carpenter. And in this case, when we're going to talk about Carpenter and we're talking about Lovecraft, we're definitely talking about In the Mouth of Madness.
Kane's writing has been known to have an effect on his readers.
Whatever he writes.
For years, I thought I was making all this up.
Whatever he thinks.
Do you read Sutter Kane?
Becomes real.
It's about people turning into things.
This is not reality.
It's all happening for real, Trent.
The best film in John Carpenter's career. In the Mouth of Madness.
Like the book?
I love it. Rated R.
From the master of horror who brought us Halloween, The Fog, then brought us some offbeat movies that certainly we've talked about, Big Trouble in Little China, They Live, Memoirs of an Invisible Man. We get this movie that is very much entrenched in Lovecraft, but also very much a Carpenter film. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I love to do, especially when we have guests on, reoccurring guests especially, is talk about when you guys first discovered In the Mouth of Madness, because we've all talked about a little bit Carpenter. Halloween is kind of easy. In October, it's going to be on. It was on TV, on streaming, easy to discover. In the Mouth of Madness, not so much. So I think it'll be an interesting, very unique tale to hear how you guys found it. So Nick, let's start with you. In the Mouth of Madness.
Ooh, this is a toughie because it's one of those gray areas. I probably discovered it on VHS or HBO back in the 90s and probably wasn't cognizant of it. I went through a very John Carpenter fix much later in life where I was pounding out a lot of John Carpenter films, mostly from the 80s stuff. But I would say probably where I got I really need to revisit In the Mouth of Madness is through a band called Frontline Assembly. As y'all know, I'm a big industrial fan, and one of my favorite things about industrial music is they sample so many movies. And FLA samples a lot from In the Mouth of Madness. So I recall there was probably one day I'm sitting there listening to the first track off their live album called Livewire. It's called Mortal. It's the ending radio broadcast from In the Mouth of Madness being played with atmospheric back music. I'm like, I know this. I know where this is from. In the Mouth of Madness, John Carpenter film? No way. And of course, I went back and revisited, and all these samples I had heard in other FLA songs started popping out. And I don't recall when that happened, probably sometime in the 2000s or 2010s, but that was probably my revisiting that film through other bands sampling dialogue and sounds from that film.
So yeah, through music for you. That's so interesting, Nick.
Which is weird because John Carpenter is such a music person. I mean, he's going through a renaissance now with all his synthwave. He's influenced so many musicians, and not just his style, but the actual texts from his movie. I mean, not just In the Mouth of Madness, but a lot of his other movies have been sampled by other musicians and incorporated into their songs. So it's amazing how, not just filmmaking, but music-wise and music textual-wise, that John Carpenter's reach is.
Josh, In the Mouth of Madness, where'd you find it?
Probably saw it on cable first, and I probably didn't know what it was the first time I watched it. But the look of it is really specific, and a lot of that has to do with Gary B. Kibbe, who was the director of photography on this, and who had been with Carpenter since Prince of Darkness, and who had worked as camera operator with Dean Cundy going all the way back to Halloween 2. Okay. So there's this wonderful visual lineage, but Kibbe's stuff, there's a lot more light in it. And certainly it still has Carpenter's compositional eye and all that stuff. But I remember watching it and being like, I don't know who this is, but some of this looks familiar. I think I had to kind of back my way into this particular one because it looks and feels like something else. It's a little bit Stephen King. It's a little bit Lovecraft. And then there's also Carpenter things inside of it. It's this wonderful hodgepodge, but it becomes almost this other universe of stuff. And I think that's one of its many appeals, is that it's Carpenter doing Lovecraft, it's Carpenter doing King a little bit. And we got Christine out of him. But when I first watched this, I was just like, wow, this is so weird. This movie has so much to it. It's almost like multi-genre. It's really a unique blend. What about you, Bernie?
I found it same thing. It's a latter day Carpenter. Before you start getting into vampires, Ghost of Mars, the last movie, The War, that he did, I think that was 2010. But this was towards the end of the bookend for me, when the movies started feeling a little less like Carpenter and more like movies that happen to be directed by Carpenter, but feel like they're just taking advantage of his name and a low budget, but we're not seeing Carpenter at his finest. And, and even when you get to movies like The Fog that are smaller, quote unquote, films, they still very much have a lot of Carpenter isms. This one for me at a time, and all right, you have to think it's 1994. And, I always like doing this to context. Shawshank Redemption, Pulp Fiction, Forrest Gump, Leon the Professional, The Lion King, Legends of the Fall, Interview with a Vampire, The Crow. These are all movies that In the Mouth of Madness is competing with, but I discovered it very much on a VHS shelf at a Blockbuster or Hollywood or mom and pop video store, probably in 96, 97 era. And at that point, this to me was not Carpenter, because at that point I was starting to understand who Carpenter was, but by way of Halloween, The Fog, and They Live in Big Trouble in Little China, this felt like another 90s horror film. When you start getting past the explosion of VCR horror, these are movies that we grew up with. If it was Halloween, then you loved it. If it was Halloween 3, you were like, all right, where's Michael Myers? I don't care. I'm still going to watch this, because that's the one thing that was there. In the 90s, you have some of these films that feel very much like the byproduct of that early New Line Cinema, Miramax, where we're starting to get a little bit past the DIY low budget version, and now
it doesn't have much of a grit. It's a lot more polished.
Yes, everything starts feeling a little bit more glossy. But it's in its look, not necessarily in its execution. Yeah. And this is a movie that actually looks better looks really good when you really think about it. There's some shots in here that are amazing.
It's a gorgeous
very
movie,
well lit, bringing in ILM, K&B to do some of the special effects.
Oh my God, yeah.
You know, you bring it all together, it works. And then in some places it does it. It's almost a more interesting movie to talk about, but not a movie that I would go back and revisit. But there's so much stuff going on here. And like you said, Josh, when you first saw this, you didn't fully get what was going on.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Nick.
All right. We got to unpack this because there's some big stuff here. Out of all the John Carpenter films, this is probably the most intertextual film. All those other films, you don't need any other source material to watch. I mean, you don't need to watch Thing from Another World or whatever it was to watch The Thing. You don't need to read Christine to understand Christine. You don't need to read Vampires to understand vampires. You don't even need to read the original Memoirs of Invisible Man for that film. But this film is so, I'm going to say meta, because it's 2 years before Scream. What Scream is doing to the slasher genre, which is borderline parody, I think In the Mouth of Madness is doing with, I don't even know what to call it, because, you know, cosmic horror is not really like a film genre per se, but it's doing kind of what Scream is doing to things like the idea of the horror author itself, like Stephen King. It's, I hate to say it, a good companion piece to this film is Garth Marenghi's Dark Place.
I think you're right.
I'm Garth Marenghi, author, dreamweaver, visionary, plus actor. You are about to enter the world of my imagination. You are entering my dark place.
Going to the extreme here, like example, this is very much a Lovecraftian story. It's very much indebted to Hunter from the Darkness, I believe, which I'll definitely get to, because I think that summarizes kind of the meta aspect of this. Lovecraft stuff, period, is meta. I mean, back in the days of Weird Tales, I mean, he would, you know, he had his Cthulhu mythos. Other people were writing in that mythos, such as Robert E. Howard and Robert Bloch. In fact, it's funny because Robert E. Bloch wrote a story called The Shambler in the Dark or something.
Mm-hmm.
And Lovecraft's response was Hunter from the Dark. That's what it was.
Yeah.
And that in the Mouth of Madness is very indebted to that story, because that story has a Robert Bloch character looking at his window, seeing this black church. Oh, I better go investigate it. But here's the weird thing is yeah, Stephen King is the substitute in this. He's substituted by Sutter Kane, and Stephen King has reached these levels of pop culture-ness that we can't even fathom. Lovecraft wasn't like that back in his days. So it's kind of funny where even like the character, Sam Neill's character, is like, this is crap pulp horror stuff. How can people read this? It's so take that instead and say, how can people read Lovecraft stuff? Lovecraft stuff wasn't popular in this time. It failed. He died penniless. Yep. But here it is, very popular. And now I'm going to bring in like the Garth Marenghi stuff of authors that take themselves so seriously that they have like a thumbprint on how they shape reality. I'm going to say like Stephen King in his cocaine era, Maximum Overdrive is basically what Garth Marenghi is in, you know, Dark Place. It's, I don't know, it's just this meta commentary on what it is to be an author, what it is to actually write things and shape things and become popular, kind of shape the world in a weird sort of way. It's just that instead of going all out for laughs and bad production, and this is in all of Carpenter's films. Carpenter's a very dark comedic writer. There's a lot of cynicism in his films.
Yep.
I think Mouth of Madness has that.
I'm somewhat of a dark person anyway, and I have a overriding cynicism about a lot of things. People have accused me of being a pessimistic person, and I'm not. I'm a short-range, short-term pessimist, but I'm a long-term optimist. Although these days events are eroding that optimism quite a bit. But I hope for the ultimate survival or ultimate deliverance of mankind. I keep thinking, well, we'll find a way. But I don't know. Well, thank God I'm old now. I don't have to worry about 50 years from now.
And I think just to build on what you're saying, Nick, first I think it's very self-referential. Because the point of the movie is actually that it's a movie about the movie that's going to bring down mankind. Mm-hmm. So you have that element. Also, I think number one, Scream is not parody, so we're going to unpack that later. because the stakes are real and the characters are funny. That's a lot closer to satire.
Sure.
But so fighting words. But I want to build on kind of your observation about kind of the point of the movie is that it is supposed to be meta and designed that way.
Yes.
So there's as you say, I think there's a lot of intercontextual things happening that are literally part of its architecture. Mm-hmm. But I think the fun of it is that it's supposed to just blow your mind. And so I think that a lot of the entertainment value in this is that there wasn't a lot. And I think that's why it wasn't necessarily a huge hit. I think it did reasonably well. But I think that at the time, there wasn't a lot to compare it to. We're years off from Scream. It's like the idea of a horror movie being this aware of itself as a product, I think is also really unique. But I think a lot of the fun of this is blending all these elements. I think in real life, and certainly in hindsight, I think King has, a fantastic bullshit meter. And so I think his sense of self-deprecation and all of that is he's not quite the egotist. But I think what's interesting about the twist in this is that, yeah, if Lovecraft was as popular as King, would it be like this? Would it look like this? One of the things that kind of struck me rewatching it is, again, this blending of elements is one of the things I wrote down is like axe murderers as transgressive acolytes of unknowable cosmic horror. I was like, I think that is genuinely one of the unique things that this movie brings to those mythos is that there is very specifically like axe murderers being the part of the mechanism by which the world is changed. And in fact, we see Trent become, right, that axe-wielding, serial killer. It's a unique way into the Cthulhu mythos because that was never really part of what the genetics of that sort of over-violent, like transgressive body horror, sure. But like the whole idea of mixing that, I think makes this movie a very interesting experience.
But it's so funny you say it because I brought up Robert Bloch earlier.
Oh, yeah.
Who is basically, aside from Italian Giallos, is the founder of the slasher genre with Psycho. Because, aside from writing Cthulhu stuff, he's writing slasher stuff with Psycho, which would give birth to the axe murders. And guess what? Full circle, here we are.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the part where in Lovecraft, it's been preached, right? It's ancient, it's unknowable, it's undescribable, it's horrible, but axe murderers we can wrap our head around. Like that is something that is tangible, and I think that's where you guys...
That's a great point.
It's funny how from Ferengi, I did not know that we have like yakety sax playing at this point in the background, where when Sam Neill first got the script, he read it as a comedy.
Well, Sam is one of my favorite people of all time. Sam is a brilliant actor. And we had worked together earlier on a Invisible Man picture, and I really loved working with him. And so I sent him the script, and he saw it as a comedy. So he played a lot of it as a comedy. He thought it was funny. And parts of it are particularly funny. I mean, ridiculously funny.
And I was listening to one of his interviews, and I'm like, okay, I'm wondering if, in the way he saw it, he's like, yeah, there is a little bit of parody here, a little bit of meta, like you guys were kind of talking about. But in the same ways that maybe axe murderers are our gateway to cosmic horror, because that feels something like that would be on the news versus the old ones doesn't. Like, I don't understand that.
Yeah,
I think that's where the genius in having Sam Neill play an insurance investigator. And Carpenter said that he kind of set him up to be like Marlowe. His default mode is basically to find that everyone is a fraud in some way, and it's built-in skepticism. And they set him up in the beginning. He's someone who is not aware of Sutter Kane in the same way that someone in our world, a world that, according to this movie, you have Stephen King and Sutter Kane as peers. Maybe you might say in this world, Sutter Kane is actually more popular than Stephen King. But but now we have someone, in John Trent's character who doesn't know who the Sutter Kane is. And because he's so grounded, doesn't believe that the publisher is actually doing this. This is all part of some outlandish marketing PR scheme that's all supposed to be staged. One, he sets up everything for us when things do get a little bit more outlandish and even supernatural. Yeah. And I think from the audience perspective, for someone that knows nothing about Lovecraft, that knows nothing about ancient evil, he's a perfect audience surrogate. He's the audience POV to say, you don't get this, but don't worry, I'll kind of take you through the journey. I think that was genius, at least in Carpenter's setup, that he created John Trent's character to be the skeptic. You don't believe this. You shouldn't believe this, because by the time we're done with this, we're going to set up something so unbelievable that you're going to share his perspective until something changes.
What he has in common with is Lovecraft's main character, the narrator from Call of Cthulhu, which through 3/4 of the story is the skeptic. He actually spends most of the story trying to disprove his great uncle Armitage's notes, like, oh, this is just a student that's taken him for a ride that had all these weird dreams, and this cult, there's a logical explanation. But the Trent character is very Call of Cthulhu-ish. It's just instead of a hard-boiled, he's not a detective, insurance person like you would see like on Double Indemnity, but very similar though.
I've always wanted to tackle H.P. Lovecraft. I've always wanted to do something with him. It's very hard because he describes indescribable horror. I mean, what is it? What does it look like? It drives people mad when they see it. So if you visualize too much of it, I think it may lose its punch. His take on terror, there's something unseen that wants to come and take back its world from us. And it's brilliantly written for its time. And the thing I love about him as a writer, it's not something that I've done particularly in my movies, but as a writer, his stories usually lead up to the last sentence being the shock. In other words, if you read The Outsider, the whole story involves this unknown person who's trapped in this world. He's trying to get out. And finally, at the end of it, he comes around, he goes upstairs. It's a beautiful kind of a ballroom. He's almost like he's in a mansion or a castle or something. And he rounds a corner, and he sees this horrible figure in front of him. And it terrifies him. He puts his hand out, and he's touching a mirror. So he's the horrible figure. When it was written, the reader of Unknown Tales and those pulp magazines, it was written to give a gasp at the very end, which is, this is brilliantly done.
Outside of Lovecraft, which I am not 100% familiar, but that's why you guys are on here, so trying to fill in the gaps. The other thing I was thinking was, in Sutter Kane, there are times where I saw a little bit of Renfield from Dracula. Like, he's supposed to be the vessel that makes everything happen, and then somewhere along the way, like, there's a handing of the baton to Sam Neill. We're going to make the way for the master, except in this case, it's the old ones, because we have to, we're going to have the ship come across and come to London. And then we're going to get through all the logistics, right? Buying the property so that we can put the coffins. Like, it's so much like man-made bureaucracy, but even an ancient evil like Dracula still needs someone to like figure out property tax, right? Like,
yeah, exactly.
And in this case, we have someone like Kane who has, I think I'm going to totally, but Jürgen Prochnow, I think that's pronounced. The fact that he wasn't American, I think, only added to the fact that an author of his popularity, of his success, would probably have a more international acclaim. So it would make sense that Jürgen Prochnow feels more European. Talks about how his books have been translated into more languages than the Bible. I'm sure King probably is approaching that, if not already. But the fact that they've made this character so much a Stephen King analog, if not more successful. Well, if Kane is supposed to be that for this, then Trent is the one that's going to take the actual manuscript and, eventually it's going to be made into the movie. So it feels very much on the pulse of like, well, people are not going to read it's like a throwaway line that Heston says, but it's one that rings true to us, right? Like, look, I hope people are going mad about this because we're going to make a book. We're going to make a movie out of it. In the world of media, this makes sense. But in the world of a vessel for the messenger of indescribable, unknown, ancient evil, yeah, a 93-minute movie adaptation probably gets really far.
Super helpful.
There's a very Marshall McLuhan message in here where, the medium is the message. So
yes.
Diving into Cronenberg territory here, but I wanted to throw out two things real quick. The first one is, Sam Neill had said that this might be a comedy, and I kind of referenced a little bit of parody. I do want to say the ending sequence when he's in the theater with his big old bucket of popcorn and, watching the events fold real time, That's the sequence in Spaceballs where they're seeing now. I mean, it really is. Which is also...
I look at that and I think that's the definition of cosmic horror, right? Because that sort of detached irony, the universe is just a movie and you're a spectator in this. You have no power. It is funny. I think it is goofy, but I think it's also terrifying. He's, I don't know, one of 4 people left on Earth, all of those lovely elements.
We were talking about how this movie was kind of successful at its time, how it kind of seemed very polished, maybe the last great of John Carpenter films. I kind of want to throw out there that it was very ahead of its time. Mm-hmm. I mentioned that it beats, the meta-ness of Scream by 2 years, but it also beats like another text that I think of is the video game Alan Wake. If y'all have ever played that game where you play a writer who, whatever he writes is what becomes real, except that one's not so cosmic horror as it is this kind of a different type of horror, although it probably gets in a very Ramsey Campbell, Children of Glacky type thing. But I mean, that predates it by, 20 years and also predates, what's the term? ARGs, alternate reality games. Yep. Yeah. I mean, before Pokemon Go, before Perplexity, I mean, what they're describing in this film is, hey, we're going to set up, a fake town and, make it part of a contest or all of this other stuff where, something that's not real is real and it can be consumed. I know that alternate reality games have really taken off probably in the past 10 years, but that wasn't something that you had back in the 90s. And I think this is, I mean, it's not an alternate reality game, but I think it kind of foreshadows that you can have that as the blurring of reality and a non-reality that has an impact on reality.
Yeah. Well, I think this gets back to kind of what you were digging into before, which is like, a lot of and I think Scream is a good thing to point to because, you've got Wes Craven coming back and revisiting elements of his career. He was not famous for being slasher. It's like his stuff was far more esoteric, Craven's early work especially. Freddy exists as something that's, a nightmare demon, more than a traditional slasher. But I think the whole idea of him directing a film that leans into the legacy of horror films that himself and other directors did, I think the same thing is present here. Carpenter is directing a horror film. The whole point of it is that it's supposed to be a message in order to bring about the apocalypse.
Well, it's like he's tapping into the same bloodline that he helped fill, right? Like,
Are we talking about Scream or Wes Craven's New Nightmare? Because both linked to a New Nightmare, and I'm like, that's a perfect, conversation.
I think that's the same. Isn't it the same year?
You know what? I got Wikipedia up. New Nightmare.
And we Google
the same year.
94. Look at that.
That's really interesting because I think that obviously that's also New Line. And I think one of the things that we should add to the conversation is the writer. So Michael DeLuca, who actually started as a writer as a very young person, he's got credits on early Freddy's Nightmares episodes. He co-wrote Freddy's Dead and stories for Judge Dredd and an episode of Star Trek Voyager. But this is one of only 2 feature-length screenplays where he refused credit. DeLuca is a much more famous and well-known for being an executive producer and also being one of the few genre-friendly producers over the course of the 80s and 90s. So if you're looking at 80s and 90s New Line stuff, we get The Mask, Boogie Nights, Dark City, Blade. He is no small part of the renaissance, the kind of we understand as New Line cinema. And so this is somebody who's writing an ultimate John Carpenter movie for somebody who he's admired for most of his career. And so I think one of the things that maybe people don't talk about enough is how smart this movie is. This movie manages to deliver high concept cosmic horror in a way that very few other feature films have ever done, and maybe even since. So even just the idea of like, what does that mean? Like even some of the mise-en-scene and montage editing in these sequences that actually help give you some of that unknowableness that people complain about in Lovecraft, where it's like, I can't describe it, I'm not going to describe it. And that's how I'm going to accomplish how indescribable it is. But there's a lot of really interesting cutaways and impressionistic approaches to these monsters by K&B in this movie. And I think some of that lends itself to this larger cosmic horror context. But I love the writing in this movie. And I think, to your guys' point, there's an investigator, there's a noir, there's a detective story. It has those Western echoes that Carpenter does so well. It's part of his DNA.
The great thing about horror movies is we're all afraid of the same things. We're born afraid. We're born crying and screaming, and my God, we're afraid of death. We're afraid of loss of a loved one, disfigurement, loss of identity. I mean, everything that you're afraid of, I'm afraid of. Same thing worldwide. So horror is such a rich vein. It's taking these archetypal fears and situations and trying to bring a new spin to them, a new idea on it. That's what's the fun about it. Fear has always motivated people ever since there have been tribes. That's the best way to get people to do something, is make them afraid of something.
I think actually one of the things that's harder about this movie, and I think one of the reasons why it maybe didn't connect, because it's definitely ahead of its time, as you say, Nick, it's hard to connect to Trent. He is not an everyman. So he is somebody who's kind of getting knocked off of his high horse. And I think one of the things that's interesting about most of Carpenter's films is that there's an everyman at the core of where our point of accessibility is. And obviously it's like, DeLuca's script is in a type of filmmaking, in this investigative or detective story. But I do think it's one of the things that makes this movie a little tougher. It's not somebody with a lot of grit who's up against impossible odds. It's somebody who thinks they've got the universe figured out and is going to get their brain opened up. So much of this is about, he thinks it's an ultimate confidence game. And it's like, no, the universe is a confidence game, Trent. And, you're getting played at the cosmic level.
I'd say it's almost unavoidable if you're going to cast Sam Neill, because the year before he does Jurassic Park.
Right.
I mean, Jurassic Park, like 12 months before, and this comes out. But with Sam Neill, you don't get that everyman quality that he's had in so many other movies. Sam Neill in a suit in that scene with Bernie Casey, where he talks about how he works at a firm. You could tell he's not blue collar by many means. Probably a lot of these insurance scams and frauds are like big money schemes where you bring him to do some really serious detective work. But, he's probably not the detective who's sitting in a ditch somewhere with binoculars. Like, he's a little bit more elevated than that.
He's high class. Yeah, he's really high class.
He's Sam Neill. It just works. And because of that, you're right. There is that difference in some of the Carpenterisms. And we have to, I got to mention the fact in Event Horizon, a movie that I think we all enjoy. There is like a representation of Lovecraftian horror, like Sam Neill has got like the bingo card set, because then a few years later he does that more cosmic Lovecraftian horror by way of Alien in 2001, but still the man must have an appreciation for it because he keeps going back to the well.
Yeah, the string of movies he's doing in this era, really interesting stuff.
I've got like 6 points of Event Horizon crossing over of Mouth of Madness. And it's not just because of Sam Neill, but like, there's sequences like when he's running down the tunnel in Mouth of Madness echoes the gravitational tunnel, where
totally,
Stiles has her head pushed in the book and all these flashes of imagery come to him. Dr. Weir does the same thing to, the captain in Event Horizon.
There's a lot.
Things from different realities.
There's a lot. There's a lot.
And I think it kind of goes back to something you were talking about earlier, Josh, the fact that maybe this is a little underrated, but Carpenter does a really good job of grounding the descent into madness. And making madness a physical location in Hobbs End, where Stiles, the woman who's driving, right, when they're taking turns, her and Trent, Sam Neill's character, driving towards Hobbs End. And in a way, when Trent puts those covers together to find that map of, is it New Hampshire?
Yeah.
That seems a little bit like, I think that, what's the term, like Deus Ex Machina, like, all right, we just need a reason to go there. And he found a reason. It seemed a little manufactured. And maybe that's the Stephen King thing. Like, is Hobbs End supposed to be like Castle Rock, or is it Derry? The other, like the two towns that King uses
it's crossing over a lot of stuff, actually.
Yeah. But if you have like that piece, the actual visualization of madness, right? The kid on the bike that then we find out is the old man. And then the windmill that's circulating just to kind of make you feel like maybe there's no way out of it. And he says the actual line, like, he won't let me out, because he's the kid / old man is referring to Cain, driving over nothingness and then suddenly going onto the covered bridge. Styles, who sees the woman / the dogs. This is before the Doberman like hellhound scene by the church, the moving painting in the lobby of the hotel. All these little things that kind of suggest that she is further into that descent into madness than Trent is.
And by the way, all those mini worlds, that's one of my favorite things about this movie is that none of them are one-to-one. You could go, this is mostly this Lovecraft story, or this is kind of this Stephen King story, but they're not all just one thing. That's one of my favorite things about this movie.
So in a way, Trent is basically saying, isn't this town, Hobbs End, supposed to be just the ultimate Sutter Kane amusement park? So if you check into this hotel, it's supposed to be like the hotel in Whispers in the Dark. And if you go into this bar, it's probably supposed to be like Hunter in the Darkness. And the lady at the hotel is meant to be like the character, like this person. So the idea is like, this is supposed to all be byproducts of someone who's a big fan of the book. And you would just be like, Easter egg, Easter egg, Easter egg. Like, oh, this is what this all is. But at least through Styles and Trent, Styles just going into madness because maybe she's more open to it, as we find out later in the movie. Spoiler alert, she may not have been there in the whole time at all.
I want to throw something out about that because you bring up, Styles' character may not have been there at all. So I'm going to throw this out there. What's another movie that didn't perform well that has a hard-boiled noir character that deals with reality?
Are we talking Donnie Darko here, sir?
No.
Blade Runner.
Now,
yeah.
This is very Blade Runner-ish. And I'm going to say that because now
if you had a bingo card with Garth Marenghi and Blade Runner for a conversation or In the Mouth of Madness, like, congratulations.
you win for the evening.
So, I mean, the movie is very overt that one of its themes is reality, but it takes the approach of what is once reality, and it takes the more sane and insane approach, which I can respect that. But there's also a very Blade Runner reality here, and I'm going to use the character of Rachel. Rachel is a replicant. She came into existence at a specific point. Everything before that is just implanted memories. That's kind of Trent's character because these characters are all characters that Sutter Kane has created. We ask the question, at what point is Trent a real character, like in the real world, and when is he a fictitious character, or has he always been a fictitious character? Now, he's going to think he's a real character, and he says so all the time. But at what point, all his background, all the cases he's worked in the past, his childhood and everything, is basically the replicant version of Sutter Kane putting a person into existence. And that's all the characters in this film. And this sounds like stoner philosophy, but I know that there's real philosophy that into this, but it's like, when do you know that something is kind of real? Because the past is already there. You can't experience the past again. It's just up here, which can be shaped. So all you know is what is now. So I don't know. I kind of view the characters in Mouth of Madness as kind of replicants under, instead of, they're all products of Sutter Kane in this. And I think it's, again, stoner philosophy, but I mean, how do you kind of wrap around reality, both insane, but also reality of what you can experience? I don't know. That's kind of where I'm going with that one, because it ties into the editor character Styles of, she gets written out of the book. She ceases to exist, which is funny because if you watch the end of the film, her name is on the poster of, he goes and watches In the Mouth of Madness starring, Trent and Styles. I'm like, I don't know.
Well, and then she doesn't exist. And that's the first thing is I love Julie Carmen's performance in this. She starts out so kind of buttoned up, and then kind of her descent, as you alluded to early, Bernie, is really kind of upsetting to watch. It's really different. She's totally seduced by it.
And just to throw this in there, it's isolated to her because Trent's asleep.
Yeah, it's super.
So he doesn't share that madness, descent with her.
No, he then has to deal with the repercussions, which I think is really great because it really puts him on the back foot, But she's so wonderful, and I loved her in Fright Night 2, which people should seek out and watch if they can. Styles' character is really interesting, and I think also I feel comes from a 40s tradition. There's a little bit more of that button down, but really sharp. She's ahead of him most of the time. She's skeptical of him. But the irony being, she's really a believer, right? She's read all the stuff. She, since she's working with him all these years, but she's a fan, which also kind of puts her like kind of on the knife's edge of what all these things are and what's coming. But I think that relationship is so interesting. But I love that you get all that creepy stuff with her. Those visual effects that are kind of being hidden in the tentacles, and then she pushes him through the door. But yeah, one of the best things, you know, when she comes around the side of the car and she's crawling upside down, like
spider walk.
The spider walk thing is like, again, in 1994, this is really different. This is really unique and kind of off-putting. You know, there's not a lot of other things to kind of point to.
And there's two things that you brought up, Josh, that reminded me. One, the door. When they show the door in that church where Sutter Kane is typing, and I was just like 1 second away from him doing the Stephen Cannell where he throws the paper in the air and you're near.
Totally.
I just wanted that. But they show the door pulsing.
And it's wet.
Yes, it just feels
like
slimy.
Oh, it's great.
You could tell there's something on the other side, but I think it's interesting to then use the door as that visualization, because as I'm watching the movie, I'm like, yeah, you know, you just don't open the door, right? But that's the point, right? Is the idea that if you use a door to visualize this cosmic horror, by using a door, it means that at some point someone has to open it. And in that case, maybe it's Kane, maybe it's Trent, maybe it's the world, by now believing enough when they're in the confessional and Kane is explaining how religion is unable or maybe fails to explain the quote unquote the anatomy of horror. And he's talking about like creation. Like that idea with that door just feels like that's supposed to represent something tangible for something we can't understand. Mm-hmm. That's what's on the other side. And if you open it, that's what you're letting out. But Nick, something you'd mentioned earlier with Styles, when he shoves her face, it felt like when he was shoving her face into that, it looked like a Xerox machine, a copy machine, as it's doing its thing. And it seems, you know, for something that's supposed to be, you know, inspired by Lovecraft, something that's supposed to be older, that Xerox machine felt very modern to me, just in the aesthetics. In the same ways that, you know, if we look at religion and it fails to explain, maybe the same ideas with this book that's being adapted into a movie, we need these things to provoke the madness, because like you're not supposed to look at the Xerox machine, or the sun or God. It makes you blind. So like, guys, don't open the door. Don't do that thing.
So two things real quick, Bernie. One, the scene of Sutter Kane dramatically ripping the paper out of the typewriter as a total Garth Marenghi move. Two, I do want to throw this out there. About 6 years earlier, there was another Lovecraftian movie that came out. It is, by all means, a terrible film, and we covered it on our podcast, called Cthulhu Mansion. And inside the titular Cthulhu Mansion, there is, in the basement, a cosmic bolted door that everyone's like, please don't open that door. There are horrors. You can't come. So what happens, of course? People mess around and the door gets opened.
I just feel like Cthulhu Mansion is like an NES game that I just never got.
Cover was really good.
The cover was great. Yes, Nintendo
horrible.
Power had like a 1-page spread on it, Josh. Yes. It was really cool. But you know,
it wasn't a fave.
It was not. It was not.
I want to bring up one more thing. I meant to bring it up earlier. We were talking about the meta-ness of Lovecraft and the meta-ness of Mouth of Madness. And that's the idea that there's a lot of writers out there that take the stance in their stories, not their real life stance. I should clarify that Lovecraft, what he wrote, was real. Yeah. And there's actually quite a few stories. I'm going to toss out there Fred Chappell's story, Weird Tales, that takes the idea that what Lovecraft was writing about actually happened, and he's putting it into, you know, fiction format to make it palpable, or awake the old ones, or so on and so forth. But there's quite a bit of Lovecraft stories as real, even as Lovecraft stuff was fiction, still being manifest out there. And Mouth of Madness is one of those types of stories that does that. In this case, it's sort of Lovecraft, but in this case, it's Sutter Kane is a real person who's writing stories that, for all purposes, are real.
Yeah. I was just saying that feels very much like the way you take Dracula and you make it more into a journal. It would be like found footage movies where you take something supernatural or outlandish like the Blair Witch, but if you add on the layer of a camera and recording and all of those logistics, it makes it feel a little bit more real, which actually makes it at least seem a little bit more scary. It's like, yeah, well, Dracula can't be real, but if we're just looking at the pages of someone's journal that someone discovered, could it be real? Maybe it's a little, there's some fiction in here, but it could also be real. Sorry, Josh.
And most of Lovecraft stories were of this confessional. This is something I experienced. I don't remember all of it. This happened to me, and it was terrible. I think that there's a great horror tradition, right, in that. I think one of the things that's unique about Lovecraft is this idea of scary books. Books are dangerous because they hold information that that should not be held and should not be witnessed. And I think one of the things that's fun about this movie is that it's like, that's really literally what it's about. It's about a manuscript that's going to change the world for the worst. And I think one of my favorite things upon a rewatch, the world's already over when the movie starts. It's like one of my favorite things is like them walking around talking to David Warner going, yeah, it's getting really bad out there. And you're like, what? What does that mean? And why is the power going out? Like, all of that feels very classic to me, but I think it's conceptual horror, which I think it gets at the core of what Lovecraft is about. And I think at the core of what those apocalypse movies that we love from Carpenter, you got to think about this for a minute. It's like, yeah, we got cool axe murders. We got some of the best creature effects that Canby has ever done, which I'm still to this day furious that I only see them in flashes. And Leo, if you hit YouTube, you can find some behind the scenes footage of how amazing these monster suits actually looked for the bridge sequence. Good Lord. Like, you could do a movie on each of them. But I think one of the things that always sticks with me in this movie is it being this greatest hits of horror, of King, of Lovecraft. And like, one of my favorite unnerving scenes in this that I wanted to highlight is like, you've got Vigo the Carpathian in the Sizzler talking to Sam Neill about his 5-year-old eating his face. You guys, that is special about horror. That is not something we're going to get in other movies, in other horror movies. That is the good stuff.
Remember, you can find the Fan2Fan Podcast at www.fanpodcast.com. Facebook, just search Fan2Fan Podcast. That's FAN, the number 2, FAN. On Instagram at Fan2Fan Podcast, or on Twitter at Fan2Fan Podcast. We'd love to hear from you, so send a message and let us know what you think of the show. Thanks.
And now, on with the show.
And you mentioned, Josh, just as we kind of wrap up, John Carpenter's Apocalypse trilogy. End of the World. Yes. We're talking about The Thing, Prince of Darkness. It wasn't a pre-planned theme here, but they certainly all share similar themes. I think these movies display a more dire version of Carpenter's worldview. And Josh, you've talked about it before, where sometimes Carpenter can come off a bit of a romantic, and that's the Howard Hawks in him. That's the stagecoach, the kid who grew up watching westerns and wound up making Assault on Precinct 13. But still, there's a part of him that's like, there's a part of Brio Bravo, John Wayne, all of that in him. These movies just feel a little bit more on the pessimistic, cynical
on the nihilist side.
Yeah. And this one especially, unlike The Thing, where it gives you this cryptic sense of hope, at least through McCready, the idea that there's someone with some common sense to realize that regardless of what this alien threat could be, I'm willing to sacrifice myself in order to kind of stop, its continual invasion of the planet. Prince of Darkness is just cryptic in general, but very much cynical. But this one feels more like you were saying, it starts with the end of humanity, the apocalypse already having been started. It feels more inevitable than some of these other films. Yes.
It's already too late. Yeah, and I think that's a good observation. I think I'd love to hear what you think, Nick, because I think one of the things that Bernie and I talked about, there is this inherent nihilism and cynicism in a lot of Carpenter's work. Mostly, I would categorize it as anti-authoritarian. Like, he just doesn't like being told what to do. Like, it's really simpler, right, than all of that. But I do think that even when we're talking about the sense of apocalypse, and even in this movie, even that it's integral to a romantic view, because you're still telling the story of the last person. You're still doing the Omega Man. You're still doing like, no, you're the last one. it's still MacReady and Childs at the precipice of, the end of the world. And even this.
I just have to add to that, Josh, because when Sam Neill walks out of the asylum and he's drawn all these crosses, towards the end when he goes to like what seems to be like the main desk right before you leave, he is wiping off all the crosses. So before he gets the extra large popcorn bowl before he goes into the theater, there is that moment where I thought, is he sane again? Because he kind of like reclaimed the sanity he had before all of these events happened to him. So there's that little piece. Well, maybe there's hope here, but then of course,
or just clinging to old habits.
Yes, there you go.
I mean but I think there's this interesting piece to the drama of this sort of apocalyptic storytelling that is inherently romantic because of the sense of scale and grandeur and where the individual sits inside of this. Obviously, if it's the apocalypse, it has to be observed. I just think that there's something inherently melodramatic about apocalypse. And when I think of the definition of romanticism, that's what I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of it's bigger than life. The idea that you would be the last person on earth, witness to the end of all things, that's inherently dramatic. That's a extreme point of view.
I'm going to take a very controversial stance here. I know that these three movies are his Apocalypse trilogy, but you have to factor in that Carpenter also has post-apocalyptic films. Escape from New York and Escape from LA are both post-apocalyptic.
Yeah, they are, yeah.
As terrible as Escape from LA is, when Snake Plissken at the very end, is able to cut the power off of the entire world, basically, and walk away with just his cigarettes. I mean, he is more or less the Omega Man, even though other people are surviving everything. But, Snake Plissken is that romantic wasteland hero that you're going to see like in a Mad Max film and a Fallout video game.
Absolutely.
You can kind of attach yourself to it. So even though the escape movies aren't apocalyptic, in fact, you can almost even say, because In the Mouth of Madness does take place in both New York and New Hampshire, that you can almost say Escape from New York follows the events of In the Mouth of Madness. Just all the crazy people went away, just leaving a desolate New York that could be turned into a prison state.
There were just robbers left, and they all shipped them to New York.
Now we're creating the Carpenter, the MCU version. It's the Carpenter version where we see how they were all put together. Maybe in this world, Nick, the aliens from They Live were actually maybe like the herald, like the Silver Surfer for the old one. Yeah, like let's just figure out how to get these people to obey, and let's take down governments. And then next thing you know, like poor John Nada, little by little, humanity just gets eroded to the point where you get a bunch of tentacle creatures that just take over the planet.
If you think about it, They Live is also a post-apocalyptic film. It's just that we didn't witness it. It was all so behind the scenes and so
already happening.
It already happened. We just didn't even see it.
It's like he's told versions of this story before. And so obviously this is kind of part of what we love from Carpenter.
As if any of us needed an excuse to revisit Carpenter.
No, I know.
So now you can go back and watch it in the, maybe the Carpenter verse, the new version where you can almost chronologically map everything out if you have it all take place. Maybe throw in Romero in there because I feel like that would all kind of actually make sense too.
No, I think it's like it's MCU. It's a My Carpenter universe.
That's right. That's
what
it's your Carpenter universe, and we're just living in it.
My Carpenter universe.
That's right. Well, if people want to find a little bit more about you guys, nickdiak.com, DIAK.com, essays, blogs, social media, you'll find what Nick's doing, podcast episodes that he has coming up at Zombie TARDIS, TARDIS, on Instagram and Twitter for Josh, what he's working on, storyboards he's working on. Guys, I mean, I think this was a fun conversation because, we all won. We had a great conversation.
We all won.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Bernie. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you so very much.
Boom.